Hello. Welcome everyone to Covering Atrocities in Xinjiang, a discussion with award-winning journalists. My name is Gisu Nia, and I'm a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council, where I help lead our strategic litigation project. The strategic litigation project is a new effort. It's a new and growing effort here at the Atlantic Council to advise on the inclusion of legal tools as a part of foreign policy, with a focus on prevention and accountability efforts for atrocity crimes, human rights violations, terrorism, and corruption offenses. We also advise and support on legal interventions for victims and survivors of violations and abuses. Rehan Asad, who will be moderating our conversation today, is a senior fellow with the Strategic Litigation Project. She's a human rights lawyer with an anti-corruption background. She is building out a stream of work focused on litigation tools that can address human rights violations in China. Our event today is the first in a series that we'll be holding over the upcoming months concerning the treatment of the Uyghurs in China. Documentation of atrocities is key to our ability to identify and advance legal interventions on behalf of victims and survivors. So we are indebted to the journalists, human rights defenders, and investigators that make that happen, and want to hear more from them today on that process. So just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Our conversation today is public and on the record. I encourage you all to follow the Atlantic Council's Twitter page, and you can tweet us at #AC Strategic Litigation. A bit long, but there we go for the hashtag. This event will be recorded and available for viewing on the Atlantic Council website and our YouTube page. We will hear from our speakers, and then we will open the floor to questions from the audience. If you're in the audience and you want to submit a question, please use the Q&A or chat box that you see in your control panel to send in questions for the speakers. You can also tweet your question with the hashtag AC Strategic Litigation. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Rehan.
Thank you so much, Gisu. The Chinese, I think at this point, everybody knows the Chinese state is carrying out a genocide against Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other groups indigenous to the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. While China is the ultimate perpetrator of these terrible crimes, the silence of global bystanders, including the vast majority of world leaders, has allowed this genocide to continue. China's economic might, coupled with its influence in the world, has created a permissive environment for atrocity crime. Additionally, with the aid of advanced surveillance and technology, the Chinese government has largely succeeded in keeping people and stories trapped within this new police state. The diligent work of journalists has allowed precious accounts of both policy and first-hand experience to reach the outside world. Through exceptional journalism, Megha Raja Gopalan and Ben Mok have made the crisis facing Uyghurs increasingly harder to ignore. In her investigative work, Megha continues to reveal the stunning scale of the oppression in the Uyghur region, while Ben's pieces have shown the genocide through the eyes of survivors themselves. Both of their work also allowed survivors to regain their agency and voice once stolen by the state. This is part one of our series focusing on the atrocities in Xinjiang. By featuring journalistic reporting, we wish to stand in solidarity with the victims and survivors and send a clear message that their story matters. So I'm delighted that we will have the opportunity to hear directly from these two award-winning journalists. As I mentioned, Megha is a senior correspondent for BuzzFeed News in London. Her reporting on Xinjiang was awarded Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting in this year. Ben Mok is a journalist based in Berlin. Ben received the inaugural Jamal Khashoggi Award for Courageous Journalism for his courage of persecution of minorities in Xinjiang. In 2021, he developed and wrote an award-winning immersive VR documentary for The New Yorker on life inside a Chinese re-education camp. So let's dive in to this discussion. So the first question that I would like to ask both of you is that the Uyghur region is on more people's minds today than before. But back when you began covering it, not much attention was being paid to that part of the world. For a reasonable mind, I can imagine it would be difficult to believe that the concentration camps are back again. How did you start covering that area? When did you begin to feel the significance and scale of this crisis?
Thank you, Rayhan. Thank you for having us. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here to speak alongside Mega about our work. For myself, I first went to the region in 2018, and it was not to cover a human rights story. A lot of my reporting is interested in the experiences of communities and countries that are often overlooked in international coverage and that often are contending with much larger national forces or international economic forces kind of around them. So the story that brought me to the region was about the Belt and Road, this giant transnational infrastructure project that was spearheaded by the Chinese government and that has dozens of member countries and hundreds of different kinds of infrastructure, trade, and industrial projects. One of which was kind of right on the border of China and Kazakhstan. So when I went to Kazakhstan to do this story, I was thinking of it as kind of a labor story. What was life going to be like for the people living in this quite remote part of Kazakhstan that was designed to become a major economic hub? So that was my thinking, and I was kind of, I would say that I was only generally aware of kind of the human rights situation in Xinjiang and was not at all aware of the scope of the detention drive, which was at the time possibly as kind of large and encompassing at the time of my visit as it has been before or since. So while I was there and I was reporting in these small villages along the border of between Kazakhstan and Xinjiang, I was astonished to learn about the scale of what was happening to people's family members across what was once quite a fluid border. So, many ethnic Kazakh and Uyghur people had family members on either side in China and in Kazakhstan, and in the past had passed quite freely between from one country to the other, and they may have been involved in economic activity, either as either trading or agriculture or something like that would take them across the border. And what I'd found was there was just a tremendous amount of fear and concern and silencing and self-censorship around China's policies in Xinjiang. And as I was conducting, interviews with different kinds of people from sort of government officials and businessmen to smugglers and herders, it was clear that you couldn't write about the Belt and Road or about China's economic ambitions in the region without also writing about this massive campaign of securitization and detention. So I worked with my editors at the Times Magazine, where I was writing this piece for, and we decided that actually kind of the backbone of this story had to be what was happening in Xinjiang. And after that, I did not expect this, but I ended up focusing on this region and on these human rights issues for the next 3 years up until now, because it struck me. I mean, now there's so much great coverage of it, but at the time it struck me as something that there was just very little international coverage of, and there were so many witness accounts coming out about the quote unquote re-education system and other forms of detention and incarceration and just kind of cultural oppression. So that's my background. I'll stop there.
Yes, thank you so much. Mega, please.
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting question. So my background is I spent a good portion of my career as a reporter in China and based in Beijing, and I sort of have the same perspective on this that Rehan has just talked about, which is that it's like, I mean, there's been lots of friction between Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang and the ruling government of China, for a long time. It's not necessarily something that started in 2016 or 2017. So like I had covered a lot of these issues, dating back to 2012 or 2013. I had like backpacked through Xinjiang as a student and everything. And I just like, I had a real affinity for the place and the people that live there. But it was in those years, like it was really hard to get editors to pay attention to stories even about human rights abuses in the region, because it was seen as this like kind of far-flung corner of the world that people like readers wouldn't really relate to or like know a lot about. And then after I moved to BuzzFeed, I took a trip there, like a reporting trip in 2017 as part of a story I was doing on the camps. And I think one of the things that really stood out to me was just like the digital and physical surveillance in the city of Kashgar in southern Xinjiang was just unlike anything else that I had ever seen anywhere. Like I had been to North Korea at that time, I'd been to Myanmar before it opened up, and it was just like, it was even compared to places like that, it was a completely kind of new experience. Like, just walking down the street and not hearing any sounds, like not the music coming out of stores and restaurants that you would hear in any other city in China, not hearing kind of people talking amongst themselves or kids playing in playgrounds outside of schools, but just hearing this ubiquitous sound of police sirens, seeing like metal bars that shops had put up in front, like as if it was a war zone, the surveillance cameras that were everywhere, checkpoints where you would see Uyghurs and Han Chinese people get into two different lines, where minorities would have their cell phones scanned with a device, but Han Chinese people wouldn't. Like all of these things were just incredibly strange to me, and just produced this incredible kind of claustrophobic feeling. And the first kind of big piece I did about this story for BuzzFeed in all the way back in 2017, we actually framed it. It included like a photo of one of the kind of early internment camps or re-education centers, as they were called at the time, as well as a description of it. But we really framed it around this environment of really oppressive mass surveillance. And to me, like I was really shocked at how that story broke through. At how readers responded to it. And I think a big part of that is because a lot of the tactics that are used targeting Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang are sort of a more extreme version of tactics and technology that are being used by governments in other parts of the world. And I think that people really strongly relate to that fear of state surveillance. And then I think later, when it became known like how large the scale was of the government's internment and incarceration programs in the region, it was kind of a sure thing that it was going to become an issue that was like a frontline news story, because it's of course of a scale of something that we haven't really seen since World War II when it comes to targeting an ethnic or religious minority group.
Thank you. And I think this truly gives me a good segue for the second question, because this is an evolving crisis in many ways. But since the crisis began, the Chinese government has attempted to claim simultaneously that the Uyghur region is both totally calm and free of mass detention, and plagued by violence which demands an exceptional, forceful response. We're now seeing increasingly clear signs of shift to long-term mass incarceration in formal prisons. What is the new version of normalcy being promoted by the state, and how can reporting continue to challenge that? And I think this is a good response to your recent piece, Mega, but as well as some of the victims' accounts in your New Yorker piece, Ben, where they talked about literally being handed a paper that announces their sentencing. So perhaps Mega, you could start.
Yeah, I guess like for anyone who's not familiar with the kind of background of this, I would just say that one of the things that was unique about, or is unique about, like the camps, the internment camps in Xinjiang, is that like based on interviews that I have done and that a lot of my colleagues in media have done, people were taken to these camps without any kind of legal process whatsoever. Like a lot of people have described just being, police giving them a knock on their door, often in the middle of the night. Someone like a police officer visiting them at their workplace, and they just get taken away in a car and end up in a camp, and then their families have absolutely no idea what's happened. And there's no arrest paperwork, there's no trial date, no access to a lawyer. Like none of those things are there, right? So this is something that is like, I think quite unique, and something that appears to be changing to some extent now. I think that it's the reason, one possible reason why that's changing is because a lot of the international outcry has been because of the kind of like lack of due process and like indiscriminate targeting based on race and religion that has characterized that system. And perhaps like now there's this mentality that like if there is like some semblance of due process, then like every country has a sort of the sovereign right to have a prison system, that it appears more defensible. I think the danger, of course, with this is that what appears to be due process is likely not due process at all. The New York Times published an analysis a couple of years ago of the prison system in Xinjiang, which, remember, is separate from the internment camps that we're talking about, in that people that go into the prison system are given sentences and kind of like other formal designations. And it found that the Times found that there were like almost as many people that are in this prison system as there are in the internment camps. So it certainly, like, I guess for me as a journalist and not a person with a law background, it almost feels like a distinction without a difference in many cases. I guess for me personally, just based on people that I've interviewed, what it seems like is that in the camps, many people have described being separated into different categories, almost like color-coded uniforms or other categorizations like that, where people that have committed, so-called low-level offenses, which aren't really offenses under Chinese law, stuff like, using WhatsApp or other kind of like banned softwares or apps, having a certain kind of photo on your phone, having a contact who lives abroad, like people who aren't like, doing something more serious than that, those people may be released, but it's not really a release. They may be, under house arrest, under town arrest. Their movements are heavily monitored and restricted, but they're not physically at the camp. That's sort of one group of people. And then you have other people who are under greater level of suspicion by the state for a variety of reasons, who may be given like much longer prison terms. I just want to add also, so the series that I with my team did last year, that explored the kind of the dynamics of the internment camp and prison systems and the sort of the scope of them. One of the things that we found that most surprised me was that if you look at the satellite images, you can see that the government has been at work constructing much larger and higher security carceral facilities all throughout the region, for the past 2 to 3 years. And the pattern we found was that in the early years of the campaign in 2016 and 2017, what was happening was that people were being detained in these like public buildings that had essentially been retrofitted as internment camps. So these were like schools and like old folks' homes and places like that had a bunch of security architecture like slapped on them, like really high perimeter walls, like barbed wire fencing, watchtowers, and like all kinds of things like that, but were essentially like not really built to be prisons. And what we found was that sort of starting in 2017, 2018, and continuing today, continuing even now, the government has been at work building larger, purpose-built and much higher security compounds that appear to be, for housing detainees or prisoners. And I think that what's remarkable about that is that I don't think anyone would build compounds like these if they didn't have the intent to incarcerate or intern people for a long period of time, because these compounds like look to be specifically built for that purpose. So I think that tells you kind of something about the government's intentions and what this is going to look like going forward.
Yeah, I just have two quick comments. I think, when we talk about concentration camps or internment camps, it evokes the past atrocities, and it takes us back to this memory of dark human history. And I think the Chinese government realized, although they actually use the concentrated education, these terms themselves, and by imposing this like prison sentencing, there is a desire to normalize it, so that we wouldn't be asking questions, civil society, whether journalistic, as yourself. So Ben, and perhaps you could also incorporate some of the survivors' accounts as well, because I personally believe that survivors' account is incredibly important for journalistic reporting, and I'm sure you do as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as you say, most of my reporting concerns collecting firsthand, in-person accounts from survivors and witnesses of both the extrajudicial detention drive in Xinjiang and then other forms of kind of carceral policies and surveillance and social control. So yeah, I want to kind of second everything that Mega said about these different systems of incarceration. And I think sometimes if you're just scanning headlines or looking at sort of brief accounts of what's happening in Xinjiang, it is easy to conflate the extrajudicial detention drive, which gets a lot of international attention, with other forms of kind of coercion and incarceration in Xinjiang. And I think it does seem clear that one thing that is happening, possibly in response to the international attention on this, on the sort of re-education camps, is an attempt to formalize incarceration through the legal process, which was not at all present in these earlier waves of detention that included a lot of the survivors that I've interviewed. One thing we tried to do in the New Yorker piece I wrote was to indicate through kind of depicting a few people's stories, the differences between these systems. So we depict a few people who, we profile a few people who went through the camp system, who indeed, as Mega says, are kind of picked up randomly and have no idea what's going on. And later there's a post hoc attempt to get them through interrogation or signing a paper or something to admit to having committed an offense. And the offense could be, they downloaded WhatsApp or they had religious material on WhatsApp or something, things that what one might consider to be pretty innocuous. And there is kind of, that is kind of this first wave. And then we have this formal incarceration process, which we also depict in this piece to show how there are trials taking place at which people are being given 15-year sentences, 20-year sentences for things like provoking ethnic discord or spreading rumors and causing trouble. And these extremely long prison terms are being levied against people who might be just well-known cultural figures or imams who went through the state madrasa and have kind of government-approved training. I think it's important not to conflate these because I think it allows for the Chinese government to make the claim that, well, this period of vocational training is over, and now we simply have, a normal justice system like other countries do, in which we are following due process. When in fact, if you look at the evidence that exists about these cases, you'll see that people are now being given really egregiously long prison terms for normative religious and cultural practices, as is the case with the imam that we write about in the New Yorker piece. So yeah, I think it is important to not get stuck in kind of a narrative that may no longer be completely accurate about the kind of facts on the ground there. And one concern that I think a lot of journalists have is that it is now very difficult to get things like eyewitness accounts from Xinjiang compared to a few years ago. So it is more difficult to say what how exactly the living conditions for kind of everyday people have changed. But certainly you can look through the many accounts that a lot of journalists, the firsthand accounts that journalists have collected. You can look at the piece I did in the New Yorker, the oral history I wrote for the Believer, and you can see that there are these different, there's not just one uniform mode of incarceration. There are kind of different programs. And yeah, as Mega said, what we're now seeing, and as she's reported really brilliantly on, is a kind of continued expansion of these more, I guess, legally justified forms of incarceration.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually did want people to understand the difference between, like, this is not some just regular prisons that we hear about in other media outlets. Like, what's happening in the Uyghur region is unprecedented repression. The Chinese government did bring back the concentration camps. As a human rights lawyer and one of the few Uyghur lawyers, like, I'm always struck by what I can say or what I should say, especially in the hope to do justice to this human suffering. As journalists, you're generating knowledge and text that will become history, and that's a matter of fact. I can imagine the immense responsibility that you both feel. And I could unpack these two questions. How do you conceive of the historical significance of what's happening in the Uyghur region? And what have you learned during the process of your own documentation? So
I can start.
Okay.
It's a tough question. I guess as journalists, you're always trying to to figure out things as quickly as possible, sort of as they happen. So it's hard to contextualize it in a way like I kind of often think about, in 10 years, how will we look back on this period and like what will have transpired. I think it's a really tough thing to conceptualize. I just want to also, Ben made a really good point in that I think one of the problems that we're facing right now is that there's a lack of firsthand accounts of people that have sort of come out of the region recently and are willing to speak publicly. And I think about that a lot because I think sort of early in the time that I was covering this, I think one of the Uyghur exile activists said to me, like, everything that you're reporting is like on this like 6-month delay. And like, we already knew about this. So like, why are you just writing about it now? And I think about that a lot because I think it's true because the sort of process for journalists to report on this now, particularly now that we're in this period where almost like a lot of the Anglophone journalists who were previously based in China have lost their access and lost their accreditation. Like the process now is very much like similar to stuff that like reporters like Ben and I have done, which is that there will be people that leave the region and then resettle in other countries like Kazakhstan, places in Europe, like Turkey, other places like that, and then achieve some sort of some level of personal security or permanent status, and are then become willing to speak to the press or to the public in other ways, either using their names or not. And sort of in the first couple of years of this, like it was initially very difficult to find those people because people were really scared of what would happen to their families, understandably, if they spoke publicly. And then there was another period where it was really easy to find those people because the kind of the seriousness of the crisis became evident. And then I think actually a lot of people, including former detainees, realized that if they didn't speak publicly about their experience, then it might be the case that nobody would ever know, and they took on that responsibility, which is really amazing. But I think that there were kind of like a number of conditions that allowed for that to take place. Probably most importantly, that some of these people were still able to get passports and leave the country. And I guess my personal experience has been that like now it's become very, very hard, as Ben said, to find people that have left the region more recently. And for like, because of that, like 6 months, like keeps getting more and more out of date. And I think that that's a real problem. So when I think about this sort of in terms of just like the context of history and like how we're going to perceive this in the future, I think about like there's just so much about what's happening on the ground there that we still don't know. There's the ways that we have to get information about what's happening on the ground there are still are so limited. They're even more limited, I think, than they were probably 2 years ago, or a year ago. I think the pandemic has made all of that worse, like even more difficult. So I think that like the way the story progresses, like the you know, how, like, I mean, I think there's been a lot of like recent coverage that I think has been really great about some of the issues in the US around supply chains and forced labor. And I think all of those things are really important. But I think that I guess going forward, like I hope that people find new methods to uncover sort of the facts on the ground, and that will sort of continue to inform our like continuing understanding of the situation.
Thank you. Ben?
I'll answer the question in kind of a different way, I guess. In terms of what I've learned and how maybe my reporting has developed over the course of kind of working on this subject. I have reported on human rights issues and indeed human rights atrocities in other countries, in the United States, in Germany, in Cambodia, in Russia. And I think naively, it was not apparent to me when I started reporting on this issue the extent to which reporting the kind of facts that I was finding out from witnesses would be so contested in the public sphere because of the kind of bellicose and belligerent rhetoric between the United States and the Chinese government, and the kind of threat and kind of growing risk of a kind of new Cold War between these two countries. So having reported on human rights issues elsewhere, it was, again, probably naively, a surprise to me to have kind of just the well-evidenced facts on the ground questioned, and to be kind of to run into kind of interference in the sense of like disinformation campaigns, questioning the existence of these facilities at all. These, in terms of I'm talking about the extrajudicial detention camps now, including from members of the Chinese government. Of course, the kind of government position changed over the course of time as the evidence became more overwhelming to from these camps don't exist at all to, well, they exist, but in fact they're vocational training centers, and also the people who are in there are were at risk of becoming terrorists or something like that. So this level of animosity, I think one way in which it changed my work was that it made me think about, I would say that one thing that maybe is different between Mega's work and mine is that she's producing often kind of quite breaking news, and compiling a lot of different kinds of primary data into her work. And my work is really exclusively from talking to people from the region and collecting an array of testimonies. And otherwise, I'm dependent on kind of secondhand material, like the kind that BuzzFeed, like the material that BuzzFeed produces. So it kind of became a question for me what sort of form my work could take that would produce kind of a lasting story, since for one thing, writing these kind of long form narrative pieces, it might be a year before it comes out. So it's certainly not going to be a breaking story when you come out with it. And secondly, how could I, what kind of form could a work take that would provide a kind of buffer against this like level of skepticism and the kind of disinformation campaigns that have been produced around this subject. So after my initial work with the Times, I produced an oral history, because for me, one of the limitations of stories that were just kind of about one person is that it can be difficult to confirm facts of someone's detention. But in fact, when you have 25 people who are all describing the exact same, they're from all over the region, their family situations are completely different, their backgrounds are different, but in fact, they're describing very similar processes of surveillance and detention and they're describing similar experiences of torture in these facilities, things like that. That kind of quantity has a quality all of its own. So one reason that I produced, for example, an oral history was just to kind of give at quite long, sort of to give without kind of a kind of word count limitation, I guess, the unvarnished and unedited witness accounts that I was receiving, and that when I was conducting these interviews were so powerful precisely because they were such full accounts of a person's life, and because they kind of meshed so well with all of these other accounts I was hearing. And that also informed the later project I did with the New Yorker, which, as you mentioned, included this VR film. And there we were kind of thinking of how to kind of bring people into these spaces that are inaccessible to conventional journalism, except through kind of choreographed state tours, which produce a really skewed version of what these places are like. And so finding multiple witness accounts from the same space and then actually architecturally reassembling those camps was another kind of attempt to use maybe a non-conventional form to address some of the limitations of reporting on Xinjiang that I kind of discovered after I kind of became interested in the subject.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I love that piece. It really brings a reader, it takes a reader into these virtual rooms, and obviously the horrific accounts of what's happening, or what's these torture rooms look like. But at the same time, it elicited a compassion from somebody who is not very much familiar with this crisis. Like, as many of you know, that I am personally affected by this crisis, so I have a deep understanding of this, an intimate understanding of this issue, but an average reader is not. So I think journalists still find it very creative ways. So I think we do have questions, and please, I ask everybody to raise your questions through Q&A. Let me first turn to the first question, and then we'll follow with other questions. I guess the first question is from Asagna, who says, recently Sri Lankan Foreign Secretary defends Xinjiang, saying there is no human rights issues in Xinjiang. Mega's observation on China's digital surveillance has become a concern not only in Xinjiang, but also along the Belt and Road nations such as Sri Lanka, with a heavy militarized regime. How do you assess China's agenda to export Chinese model of securitization to nations like Sri Lanka?
It's a very good question. I don't want to speak directly about Sri Lanka because I haven't really written about China's relations with Sri Lanka, so I'm not super familiar with that issue. As a general point, I think there's a lot of discussion about whether China is exporting its surveillance model to other countries. I'm actually not I'm not that sold on the argument that there's a specific kind of surveillance that's unique to authoritarian countries, and that it cannot be either made or exported to countries that are that are not authoritarian. I think all of these things kind of exist on a spectrum, and I find it more helpful to look at both the companies and the policies associated with surveillance, and look at how what their kind of motivations are. So in the case of China, for instance, you have a lot of private companies, including really large companies that make technologies like face recognition cameras, software for monitoring prisons, cell phone data extraction devices, cell phone monitoring software, all kinds of things like that, that have used those technologies extensively in Xinjiang, and then are also trying to export their same technologies to markets in other countries. I've seen this happen firsthand. I've been to industry conferences where there are Chinese industry executives that explicitly make the argument that China has reduced crime rates using technologies like this, with police departments purchasing surveillance technology and using it on people, including in places like Xinjiang, but not limited to Xinjiang. So clearly there's some inspiration that's being taken. China is always the Chinese government is always talking about, its low crime rates in places like Xinjiang, and in fact has repeatedly boasted that there have been no terrorist incidents in Xinjiang in the past few years, despite all of these policies. Having said that, I think it's really important not to oversimplify this issue, because we're talking about a lot of disparate actors. Like, we're talking about private companies, we're talking about state-owned companies, we're talking about companies that have significant subsidies from the state, but or like may not have state investment. And then also we're talking about governments, we're talking about city governments, provincial governments, we're talking about the central government and like different bodies under these. These actors may all have different kinds of motivations. And I think it's important not to oversimplify it and say that this is the central government of China that has an articulated policy to export its style of surveillance or its model of surveillance to other countries. I think that, it's sort of tough to see like what the motivation for that might be. I think it's more believable to me that there are lots of countries in the world that have governments that want to spy on certain groups. There are democratic countries that want to do that. There are authoritarian countries that want to do that. There are lots of countries sort of in the middle of that spectrum that have those motivations. And when they may see that China is doing this, and they may think, well, I can, we can do this same method, right? It may not look like what it does in Xinjiang. It may not look that extreme. Because remember, like, every country has different legal systems when it comes to surveillance, and the way that police and other authorities can use surveillance systems. But it may sort of take some cues from how that monitoring has worked in Xinjiang and in other parts of China. So I think it's really important to differentiate those things. And and then I would just add one more thing, which is that I think it's really important also to look at how multinationals from the US, from places like Japan, Israel, various countries in Western Europe, are also developing surveillance technologies that more or less do the same thing as surveillance technologies that are used in China, and are exporting those as well, exporting those sometimes to authoritarian governments, places where citizens have very little recourse or very few avenues to push back against abuse of their privacy rights. I think it's important to consider that when we're talking about like how surveillance is like reshaping the world, because it's not just a situation where you have China or any other country with like a heavy-handed surveillance state exporting the technology. It's a case where you have like a demand and business incentives for companies to like make these products, and like kind of very, very few legal controls on how those products can be sold and how they can be used.
Yes, thank you so much. Ben?
I'll just add one or 2 points to that. I thought that was a really good answer, and particularly something I agreed with was the fact that the actual methods of surveillance are hardly unique to Xinjiang, as Meg has pointed out. If anything is unique, it is simply the Chinese government's ability to act on the information gathered via those surveillance technologies, and kind of the absence of in Xinjiang currently a civil society or a form of non-government check that can critique those policies. But the technologies themselves are hardly, for me, I think in my mind the most concerning element. But it's part of a larger ecosystem of surveillance and control. So that's the one thing I would add on that point. The other aspect of this question refers to Sri Lanka's investment in Belt and Road projects, which I do touch on in the Times Magazine piece that I wrote. I mean, it came out in 2019, so it's a couple years old. But at the time, one of the kind of controversial events that had happened was a port in Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt and the ownership had been transferred over to a state-owned enterprise in China. And this was kind of a fear, there was a fear that this kind of thing could happen in other countries that had large investments and that had in fact taken large loans from China to kind of build these infrastructure projects. So that, that's something that I think people in Sri Lanka have been concerned about for years now. And I think that it kind of serves as a case study for ways in which these investments can produce, further forms of debt and connection to China. The last thing I'll say is also in that article I mentioned the expansion of special economic zones. And that article is obviously focused on Kazakhstan, where the first special economic zone outside of kind of China's physical borders was established at Korgos. But at the time that I wrote the article, there were more than a dozen planned for different countries, including like countries in Africa that don't share a border with China. And one thing that happened not long before my reporting there was that someone from Xinjiang had been detained, extra legally detained on the Kazakh side of this special economic zone and had been taken into China and given a prison sentence there for allegedly for crimes he had committed while in China. So it raised the question for observers whether the degree of kind of legal autonomy that exists in these special economic zones, which are in theory going to be proliferating through Belt and Road partner countries.
And I agree with both of you. I don't think the Chinese government is hunting in these like repressive tools to authoritarian governments and say like, this is how I treat my minorities, please use them. But it is creating examples. And what I'm concerned is the negative trends that this would create and also culture of impunity. That being said, let's take the second question. I think somebody asked a question. Look, I'm not going to take this question because if we're going to get into what about them, like what about the US, there's a much bigger crisis happening. And those issues also deserve attention, but for another forum.
Can I just say one quick thing about that question? Actually, I don't mind addressing it briefly. Well, I won't give my whole spiel, but there's a very good new book or fairly new book out by Sean Roberts, an academic, a scholar on Xinjiang, called The War on the Uyghurs. And if you just look at the cover, it might seem like it's just going to go over a lot of the material that we went over about China's policies towards Uyghurs in Xinjiang. In fact, what it's really about the global war on terror and how the United States' policies, their counter-terror policies and their kind of ability to terror wash, to kind of render any activity or community that they would like to better administrate or police or eliminate as terrorists has been an extremely successful global program that has been exported to many other countries. I would say most notably China. And many of the things described in this question I think are atrocities, and I think are kind of abysmal. And I certainly don't support the U.S.'s foreign policy in a lot of different ways. But I will say that one thing that book does extremely well is to show the connections between the U.S. and China in terms of the way in which certain groups in Xinjiang became labeled by the U.S. and the UN as terrorist groups, which Roberts makes a convincing case may have been done in order to secure China's support for the invasion of Iraq on the UN Security Council. So the idea that there's kind of no connections here, I mean, it's not true. I mean, I certainly think there's this is a valid critique, but I'm not a representative of the U.S. government, so it doesn't pain me to say that at all. But certainly, and other scholars too, including Darren Byler, have written really valuable articles about the connection between counterterror policies in the U.S. And the U.S. war on terror, and how these policies have been reshaped in Xinjiang. So that's all I'll say about that.
Mega, would you like to add anything?
No, I think that pretty much sums up what I would have said. And I would also recommend the book, wholeheartedly.
And I would recommend the book as well. It's a wonderful book. Okay, so I think this question is from Ian King. How much and how effectively is China suppressing stories about the camps in foreign media?
I can talk about that. I think that, of course, there's an effort to suppress these stories, and I think that it's been partially effective, but like not necessarily for the reasons that you would think. It's not the case that the government is like calling foreign media bureaus in China and telling them, if you don't, trying to implement like pre-publication censorship all the time and stuff like that. I guess just from my personal experience, working in the country, like that's not really how it works. I think the tactics that are used to prevent these stories from coming into publication are a lot more subtle. So for instance, like a flight from Beijing to Urumqi is pretty expensive. Like it can be like upwards of $800 and stuff like that. And the reason that matters is because for foreign journalists, unless you're on like a state controlled tour or something, as soon as you arrive in the region, you're probably going to be followed and you're probably going to be detained at least once, if not more than that. And effectively what that does is A, it prevents you from working, and B, it sort of convinces anyone who might talk to you that they shouldn't cooperate with you because somebody's watching and there could be repercussions to them. So that has produced, I think, a real chilling effect on coverage, unfortunately. Just that like lack of access, the lack of ability to travel freely in the region and to get a sense of how things are on the ground. I think that's been a really difficult thing. And then the other thing I would say is just like, there have been a number of journalists who have been, had their visas revoked or, that sort of like it appears in relation to their coverage of this issue. There are journalists that have had their visas revoked for other coverage reasons. So it's a tactic that the government uses quite often. But that like the threat of that happening and the sort of ambiguity associated with it, like the fact that there's not a particular red line, but that the line that you can cross is ambiguous, I think it has probably been effective at suppressing coverage as well. And then the last thing I would add is just the expulsion of many of the Anglophone correspondents from China, I think has made it really difficult to get up-to-date information on the ground, which I think and if you don't have like that's sort of the way that news works. Like if you don't have something new to say, if you can't sort of push the story forward, a lot of times at least in like kind of like a newspaper setting or like more of like a daily news format, it can be really difficult to convince editors to keep running stories on the same subject. And I think that's definitely an obstacle.
Yeah, I'll just add just a little context from my experiences reporting outside of China. One thing that has really struck me since I first started going to the, over 4 trips to kind of the Kazakhstan-China border since 2018 is how the extent to which the government in Kazakhstan has come to suppress information about Xinjiang and activists' activities. I wrote a piece for the London Review of Books about the persecution of a kind of a very well-known activist from Xinjiang, Serikjan Balash, who had run this human rights group out of Almaty, who was disappeared and then forced to sign a forged confession and then put on trial. Clearly because of his activities, publishing videos with witnesses and survivors to camps and their family members. And I would say I've heard a lot of other stories, some of which, I can't really speak in detail about, of the kind of attention from security services and police officers for people who are, for example, trying to raise attention for their family members who have disappeared in Xinjiang, who are people who are living in Kazakhstan. And there are similar stories out of Turkey of activists and prominent figures being disappeared or detained or deported. I don't think this stuff is being particularly orchestrated by China necessarily. I think there is kind of a set of common interests among these countries that has to do with their close economic ties, that leads them to want to suppress this material. And I would say it's become much more difficult for me to even justify conducting these interviews and using people's real names as you want to do for kind of gold star journalism, because of the repercussions that not only their families can face back in China, which was always a risk, but that they themselves may face even in other countries outside of China. So I would say that that has been an extremely effective form of suppression, just in terms of my own reporting.
Thank you. I guess there seems to be a few more questions, but our time is running up. So as we wrap up this discussion, I think you both highlighted the difficulty and the lack of access to the region, but also survivors. Few people are coming out. And in fact, Mega, you're even banned from going to, I hope you're not banned permanently, but you
Not
couldn't renew you couldn't renew your visa, you got expelled. And Ben, I don't know if you will get a visa to go and explore this region and get to tell those stories, because you've done this remarkable work with the New Yorker. So under these circumstances, like, how are you planning to continue this important work?
So yeah, I mean, we produced 4 stories in our series last year. We actually had another story come out just this month, which was an architectural analysis that measured like the gross floor areas of all of the camps and prisons that we had identified in the region, and compared it to China's standards for its prisons, which are it's a public document, like how many people they can have per square foot in a prison. Many countries have documents like this, and we use that to arrive at an estimate for how many people could be kept in this in the carceral systems in Xinjiang. We have another couple of pieces in the works that rely on similar techniques, around trying to basically explore, some of the facts on the ground in the region, as we have done last year. I guess going forward, I'm really interested in the implications for global supply chains, like how supply chains are going to ensure that they are free of forced labor from the region. I'm really interested in the surveillance companies that are popping up there, and that are selling their products in other parts of the world. And of course, as we've discussed today, I'm interested in kind of how the government's policies towards Muslim minorities, Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in the region will evolve, like whether we're going to start seeing a lot of people getting handed down with these really long draconian prison sentences, whether the government will use other means to continue to suppress people, or whether we'll see a lightening of these policies in response to continued or heightened international pressure. And I'm also really interested to see how the international community will respond as this story continues.
First, I'll just say that for months I have been kind of sounding the horn that Mega and her team at BuzzFeed are producing the best journalism. I mean, it's the best one-stop shop if you want to know what's happening in Xinjiang. We used some of their findings in our New Yorker piece. So it was, it felt like great justification when they won the Pulitzer for it, which was extremely deserved. And I think it highlights the way in which it's important to use a variety of kinds of evidence to produce kind of a whole picture. You can't just rely on satellite images. You can't just rely on, witness testimony. You need different kinds of people with different kinds of expertise and access. And that's kind of the team that they've put together, which is so impressive to me. Given the restrictions on reporting, I think it's an open question what kinds of evidence will become available and what journalists can do with them. As I mentioned, I'm someone who kind of is a long form writer, and for me, this material that I've collected, a lot of which I've published, some of which I haven't, as part of a longer project that is going to be published as a book in the distant future, about the ways in which states produce fugitive populations and the ways in which communities and activities can be rendered fugitive, and kind of similarities and differences between different cases of that phenomenon. So obviously, Xinjiang will be a kind of a flagship case, and maybe kind of the most, we could say, egregious or dystopian seeming case of that, but it's hardly unique in the region or kind of across the world. So going forward, I'm kind of be working on building links between kind of the existing evidence on life in Xinjiang for ethnic and religious minorities, and similar in different cases elsewhere in the world, and kind of what we can learn about those phenomena, those communities, and then their strategies of resistance and resilience.
Thank you so much. I guess like we could go on to talk about this crisis for another hour, because there's so much to cover. Whether we haven't even begun to talk about the complicity from the entertainment industry or sports industry and business as well, and many others. But I think both of your work, and we all agree that have been so crucial in illuminating the truth as to what's happening, and especially thanks to all these brave survivors and victims' family who place that confidence in you to tell their stories. And with that, I do want to thank both of you for coming here to discuss this important issue with me, and also Ben for highlighting some of the short failings of the US foreign policy that in some ways attributed to this crisis. And hopefully the US government can also reflect, because while we invite the Chinese government to self-reflect and reverse its policy, we need to ask the US government to do the same. And with that, lovely thoughts, and hopefully the Chinese government would tune in as well. And hopefully we'll see different kinds of discussion, maybe like rebuilding lives after the concentration camps. So thank you so much for all the listeners tuning in, and thank you, Gisu, for sort of collaborating on this event. And we look forward to hosting many future events on this topic and many other topics that really deserves our attention. Thank you.